You're sitting in a comfortable chair, perhaps in a library or a quiet room, when you pick up a psychology textbook from the 1970s. As you flip through the pages, you find photographs that make you pause. Young men in prison uniforms, their faces showing genuine distress. A caption explains this was just an experiment, that these were college students playing roles. But the fear in their eyes looks terribly real. You close the book slowly, wondering how such a thing was ever allowed to happen, and what other experiments might be documented in chapters you haven't reached yet. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive. Or if you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet, where we explore the fascinating and sometimes unsettling stories of human history. Tonight, we're venturing into a particularly complex territory. Experiments conducted on human subjects that pushed ethical boundaries, violated trust, and sometimes caused genuine harm in the pursuit of knowledge. So settle into your most comfortable position, let your breathing slow and deepen, and join me as we journey through 10 remarkable and troubling cases that changed how we think about research ethics, human rights, and the responsibilities we owe to one another. These stories are part of how we got to where we are today, where informed consent isn't just a formality, but a fundamental human right. In the summer of 1971, Stanford University psychology professor Philip Zimbardo placed an advertisement in local newspapers. The ad sought male college students to participate in a psychological study about prison life. The pay was $15 per day, which was decent money at the time, and the study would last 2 weeks. 75 young men responded to the advertisement, eager for both the money and the interesting experience. Zimbardo and his research team carefully screened the applicants, conducting interviews and psychological tests to select the most stable, healthy, and normal participants. They deliberately excluded anyone with a history of psychological problems, drug use, or criminal behavior. From the 75 applicants, they selected 24 young men who were, by all measures, emotionally stable, physically healthy, and law-abiding. These weren't troubled individuals or people predisposed to violence. They were ordinary college students, the kind you might sit next to in class or meet at a coffee shop. The researchers then did something interesting. They flipped coins to randomly assign these 24 young men to 2 groups. 12 would be prisoners, and 12 would be guards. This random assignment was crucial to the experimental design. It meant that any differences in behavior that emerged couldn't be attributed to pre-existing personality traits. The prisoners and guards started out as the same kinds of people. What would happen next would reveal what roles and situations could do to ordinary human beings. The experiment was set to take place in the basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall, where Zimbardo's team had constructed a mock prison. They'd converted a corridor into a prison yard, individual rooms into cells with barred doors, and created a small closet that would serve as solitary confinement. The attention to detail was remarkable. The researchers wanted this to feel as real as possible, to create genuine psychological immersion in the prison experience. On a quiet Sunday morning, the experiment began in a way that none of the student prisoners expected. Actual Palo Alto police officers, cooperating with the study, arrived at the homes of the young men assigned to be prisoners. They arrested them on charges of armed robbery, conducted real searches, handcuffed them, and transported them in police cars to the Stanford County Jail, which was actually the basement of Jordan Hall. This wasn't explained to the students beforehand. The shock and confusion were intentional, designed to create the disorientation and powerlessness that real prisoners experience. At the mock prison, the arrested students were stripped, searched, deloused with a spray, and given uniform smocks to wear with their assigned numbers on them. They were given no underwear beneath these smocks. A chain was placed and locked around one ankle as a constant reminder of their imprisonment. They were issued bedding, soap, and towels, and then placed in their cells. From this moment forward, They would be referred to only by their numbers, never by their names. Their individual identities were being deliberately stripped away. The students assigned as guards received different treatment. They were given khaki uniforms, whistles, handcuffs, and reflecting sunglasses that prevented anyone from seeing their eyes. This detail about the sunglasses was psychologically significant. It created anonymity and prevented emotional connection. The guards couldn't be read, couldn't be reached through eye contact, couldn't be humanized. They were given clubs, though told these were only symbolic and not to be used for physical violence. They were informed that their job was to maintain order and enforce prison rules, but they were given minimal specific instructions. How they chose to do their job was largely left up to them. The transformation began almost immediately, but it accelerated rapidly. Within hours, the guards began asserting their authority in ways that went beyond maintaining order. They woke prisoners in the middle of the night for counts, requiring them to line up and recite their numbers. They made prisoners do push-ups, sometimes placing their feet on prisoners' backs while they exercised. They denied prisoners access to bathrooms, forcing them to use buckets in their cells. They confiscated mattresses from prisoners they deemed uncooperative, making them sleep on concrete floors. By the second day, the prisoners attempted a rebellion. They barricaded themselves in their cells using their beds, removed their stocking caps and identification numbers, and shouted insults at the guards. This rebellion became a turning point in the experiment. The guards responded with fire extinguishers, blasting the prisoners with cold streams to force them away from the doors. They stripped the prisoners naked, removed the beds from cells, and placed the rebellion's ringleaders in solitary confinement. But the guards didn't stop there. They began using psychological tactics to break down prisoner solidarity. They created a privileged cell where prisoners who hadn't participated in the rebellion were given back their uniforms, beds, and allowed to wash and brush their teeth. Prisoners in the bad cells could see the better treatment their fellow prisoners received. Then, arbitrarily, the guards switched which prisoners were in the privileged cell, creating confusion and distrust. Prisoners began to wonder if some of their fellows were actually informants. The solidarity that had enabled the rebellion began to crack. The psychological tactics became increasingly sophisticated and cruel. Guards forced prisoners to repeat their numbers over and over during counts that could last for hours. They made prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands. They denied prisoners food, kept lights on throughout the night to disrupt sleep, and forced prisoners to sing songs or laugh on command. Some guards were particularly creative in their cruelty, inventing degrading tasks and games that served no purpose except to humiliate and dominate. Zimbardo, who was serving as prison superintendent in addition to lead researcher, became increasingly concerned about one prisoner who was showing signs of severe distress. The young man, prisoner 8612, began suffering from acute emotional disturbance. He cried, he raged, his thinking became disorganized. After just 36 hours in the experiment, he told Zimbardo he wanted to leave. But rather than immediately releasing him, Zimbardo tried to convince him to stay, telling him he was weak and couldn't quit. Eventually, when the prisoner's distress became undeniable, Zimbardo released him. This was the first sign that something was going terribly wrong. More prisoners began breaking down. Within the first few days, several participants had to be released due to severe emotional distress, exhibiting crying, rage, acute anxiety, and in some cases, physical symptoms of extreme stress. These weren't weak individuals. Remember, they'd been specifically selected for their psychological stability. Yet the prison environment was breaking them down in days. What's particularly disturbing is how Zimbardo himself became absorbed in his role. He stopped being primarily a researcher, observing behavior, and started being a superintendent concerned with running his prison. When prisoners' parents came to visit and expressed concern about their son's conditions, Zimbardo worried about prisoners escaping rather than about their welfare. When a rumor spread about a possible breakout attempt, Zimbardo moved the prisoners to actual jail cells temporarily, completely caught up in the simulation's reality. The turning point came on the 6th day of what was supposed to be a 2-week experiment. Christina Maslach, a recent Stanford PhD and Zimbardo's girlfriend, came to observe the study. She'd heard about the experiment and was curious to see it. What she witnessed shocked her. She saw prisoners being marched to bathrooms in bags over their heads, guards shouting at them, young men who looked genuinely traumatized. She was the only person among dozens who had observed the experiment to clearly object to what was happening. Maslach confronted Zimbardo, telling him that what he was doing to these young men was terrible and unethical. Zimbardo initially defended the experiment, but Maslach's clear moral stance from someone outside the prison's psychological bubble finally broke through. That night, Zimbardo ended the experiment. 6 days in, less than halfway through the planned 2 weeks, the Stanford Prison Experiment was terminated. The findings that emerged from those 6 days were both fascinating and troubling. The random assignment meant that prisoners and guards had started out as similar people, yet their behaviors diverged dramatically based solely on their assigned roles. About 1/3 of the guards exhibited genuinely sadistic tendencies, seeming to enjoy their power and finding creative ways to humiliate and degrade prisoners. Another third were tough but fair, enforcing rules strictly but without apparent pleasure in cruelty. The final third were relatively passive, not participating in abuse but also not intervening to stop it. The prisoners, meanwhile, had largely internalized their powerless status, even when they could have easily left. The prison wasn't real, they could have just walked out and faced no legal consequences. Most stayed and accepted their degraded treatment. They'd begun to psychologically accept the reality of their imprisonment. When they were finally released and debriefed, several prisoners expressed that it hadn't felt like an experiment anymore. It had felt real. Zimbardo's interpretation of these findings emphasized the power of situations and roles to override individual personality and values. His argument was that good people could do terrible things when placed in certain situations, with certain roles and pressures. The experiment seemed to demonstrate that institutional environments and assigned roles could be more powerful than individual character in determining behavior. The Stanford Prison Experiment became one of the most famous studies in psychology, frequently cited in textbooks and popular discussions about human nature, authority, and the psychology of evil. It's been used to explain everything from prison guard brutality to military abuses to corporate malfeasance. The photographs from the experiment, showing distressed young men in prison uniforms and others in guard uniforms with mirrored sunglasses, became iconic images of psychological research. However, in recent years, the experiment has faced significant criticism and reevaluation. Researchers examining Zimbardo's archives have found evidence that the guards were coached to be tough, that some of the prisoners' most distressed behavior might have been performed rather than genuine, and that Zimbardo actively intervened to create conflict rather than simply observing naturally occurring behavior. The experiment's lack of proper control groups, its small sample size, and the impossibility of replication due to ethical concerns all raise questions about how much we can actually conclude from it. There are also serious questions about whether the experiment tells us about prisons and authority in general, or just about this particular situation that Zimbardo created. Real prisoners face years of confinement, not days. Real guards work within institutional structures with supervisors, procedures, and accountability. The artificial nature of Zimbardo's prison, the temporary nature of the roles, and the unique pressures of the experimental situation may have created dynamics that don't translate to real-world settings. Despite these criticisms, the experiment remains culturally significant. It raised crucial questions about research ethics that contributed to the development of stricter review procedures for studies involving human subjects. It sparked important discussions about how easily ordinary people can be led to participate in harmful systems. And it demonstrated, whatever its methodological limitations, that situations can powerfully influence behavior in ways we don't always anticipate. In 1939, in the small city of Iowa City, a graduate student named Mary Tudor was about to undertake a thesis project that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was working under the supervision of Wendell Johnson, a prominent speech pathology professor at the University of Iowa who himself stuttered, and had devoted his career to understanding and treating this condition. Johnson had developed a theory about stuttering's origins, and he wanted to test it. The experiment they designed would deliberately attempt to create stuttering in children who spoke normally, and it would target some of the most vulnerable children in society, orphans. The theory Johnson wanted to test was called the diagnosogenic theory of stuttering. This complicated name embodied a simple but powerful idea, that stuttering was caused not by any physical or neurological problem, but by the diagnosis itself. Johnson believed that when parents or teachers labeled a child's normal speech disfluencies, the ums and uhs and repeated words that all children produce, as stuttering, the child would become anxious about their speech. This anxiety would then create actual stuttering, which would increase anxiety further, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. In Johnson's view, stuttering was created by negative attention to normal childhood speech patterns. If this theory was correct, Johnson reasoned, it should be possible to create stuttering by simply treating normal speech as if it were problematic. Conversely, treating actual stuttering as normal should help it disappear. This was the hypothesis that Mary Tudor's thesis would attempt to test. What made this experiment particularly troubling was the population they chose for their test subjects. Tudor and Johnson selected 22 children from the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans' Home in Davenport, Iowa. These were children who had lost one or both parents and were living in institutional care. They were particularly vulnerable. They lacked the protection and advocacy that parents would provide. They were accustomed to following adult authority, and their consent or objections would be easily overridden. In the ethical framework of 1939, children had few rights and orphans even fewer. Tudor and Johnson could conduct an experiment on these children that they could never have done with children who had families to protect them. The children were divided into 4 groups based on whether they already stuttered and what kind of intervention they would receive. The first group consisted of children who stuttered who were given positive speech therapy, being told their speech was fine and any disfluencies were normal. The second group consisted of children who stuttered who were given negative feedback, being told their stuttering was severe and needed improvement. The third group, and this is where the experiment crossed into genuinely harmful territory, consisted of children with normal speech who were given positive feedback, being told they spoke beautifully. The fourth group was the truly unethical one, children with normal, fluent speech who were given negative feedback. Tudor was instructed to tell these children that they were beginning to stutter, that their speech had problems, and that they needed to be very careful about how they talked. She was to criticize their normal disfluencies, correct them constantly, and make them self-conscious about every aspect of their speech. The goal was to create stuttering in children who had previously spoken normally, thereby proving Johnson's theory about the power of negative labeling. Mary Tudor conducted her experiment over several months, meeting with the children regularly for speech sessions. For the children in the negative therapy group, the ones being told their normal speech was problematic, the experience was genuinely distressing. Tudor's notes, which would be discovered decades later, reveal the psychological impact of her interventions. The children became anxious, reluctant to speak, and increasingly withdrawn. They began to monitor their own speech obsessively, exactly as Johnson's theory predicted. One girl in the negative therapy group, who had previously been talkative and confident, became so anxious about speaking that she would barely talk at all. Another child began showing signs of actual speech problems, developing some of the hesitations and repetitions characteristic of stuttering. The children were being damaged in real time by an experiment designed to prove a theory about how such damage occurred. The irony was lost on neither Tudor nor Johnson at the time. They knew they were harming children, but they justified it as necessary for advancing scientific knowledge. The results of the experiment were mixed and hardly provided the clear proof that Johnson sought. Some children in the negative therapy group did develop speech problems, but not all of them did. Some children who actually stuttered improved with positive therapy, but others didn't. The data was messy, as human behavior data often is, and didn't provide the clean support for Johnson's theory that he'd hoped for. What was clear, however, was that the negative therapy had caused real psychological harm to children who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Mary Tudor completed her thesis in 1939 and received her master's degree. The study was never published in a peer-reviewed journal, perhaps because Johnson recognized the ethical problems with the methodology, or perhaps because the results weren't as compelling as he'd hoped. Tudor went on to have a career in speech pathology, but she reportedly felt guilt about the experiment for the rest of her life. She knew she had harmed children in the name of research, and that knowledge troubled her deeply. Wendell Johnson continued his distinguished career at the University of Iowa, becoming one of the most influential figures in speech pathology. He developed theories and treatments that helped many people who stuttered, but he never discussed the 1939 orphanage experiment publicly. The study remained buried in university archives, known to few people, its victims unaware of what had been done to them and why. The experiment might have remained obscure forever if not for a journalist named Jim Dyer. In 2001, more than 60 years after the study was conducted, Dyer was researching a different story when he stumbled across references to the orphanage experiment in university archives. He recognized immediately that this was a significant and disturbing story. Dyer's article in the San Jose Mercury News brought the monster study, as it became known, comparing it to Nazi experiments, into public awareness for the first time. The revelation of the study sparked outrage. The surviving participants, now elderly adults, learned for the first time why they had been singled out for criticism and negative attention during their childhood. Some had struggled with speech problems throughout their lives, never understanding where these problems originated. The discovery that their difficulties had been deliberately induced by researchers as part of an experiment was devastating. The University of Iowa faced difficult questions about what had happened in its speech clinic more than 6 decades earlier. The university commissioned an investigation, which confirmed the study's basic facts and acknowledged that it had violated ethical standards, even by the looser standards of 1939. The university issued a formal apology to the study's victims, expressing regret for the harm that had been done to them. In 2007, 3 of the study's surviving participants filed a lawsuit against the state of Iowa, which controlled the university, seeking compensation for the psychological damage they'd suffered. The lawsuit argued that the experiment had caused lifelong speech problems, anxiety, and psychological trauma. It highlighted how the researchers had deliberately targeted vulnerable orphans who couldn't refuse to participate and who lacked advocates to protect them. The case was eventually settled out of court, with Iowa paying $925,000 to the victims. This settlement, while providing some financial compensation, could never truly repair the damage done. The victims had lived their entire lives affected by an experiment conducted when they were children, an experiment designed specifically to harm them to test a theory. The apology and settlement came too late for many participants who had already died, never knowing why they'd been subjected to such treatment or receiving any acknowledgement of the wrong done to them. The monster study raises profound questions about research ethics, the treatment of vulnerable populations, and the limits of what scientists should do in pursuit of knowledge. Even in 1939, there were ethical standards that should have prevented this experiment. The deliberate infliction of psychological harm on children, particularly orphans who lacked protection, violated basic principles of human decency that transcended any particular ethical code or regulation. What makes the study particularly troubling is that it produced little valuable knowledge to justify the harm inflicted. Johnson's diagnosogenic theory, which the study was meant to support, turned out to be only partially correct. While negative attention to speech can indeed increase anxiety and worsen existing stuttering, it's not the primary cause of stuttering in most cases. Modern research has shown that stuttering has complex causes, including genetic, neurological, and developmental factors. The children harmed in the monster study suffered for a theory that was fundamentally flawed. The study also highlights the particular vulnerability of children in institutional care. The orphans at the Davenport home were chosen specifically because they lacked parents to advocate for them, to question the research, or to remove them from the study. This exploitation of powerless populations for research purposes has occurred repeatedly throughout history, and the monster study stands as one of many examples of how researchers have taken advantage of society's most vulnerable members. On a summer day in 1961, a man arrived at a Yale University psychology laboratory in response to a newspaper advertisement. He'd been told he would participate in a study about learning and memory, and he'd be paid $4.50 for his time. What he didn't know was that he was about to participate in one of the most famous and controversial experiments in psychology's history, one that would reveal something deeply disturbing about human nature and our relationship with authority. The man, like all participants in Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, was greeted by a researcher in a gray lab coat who explained the study's purpose. The researcher said they were investigating whether punishment helped people learn better. 2 participants would be involved in each session. One would be the teacher, and one would be the learner. The learner would try to memorize word pairs, and the teacher would test them and deliver electric shocks for each wrong answer. The shocks would start at a low level and increase with each mistake. To determine who would play which role, the researcher held a drawing. The man pulled a slip of paper that said teacher. The other participant, a friendly middle-aged man who'd introduced himself as Mr. Wallace, pulled learner. What the teacher didn't know was that this drawing was rigged. Mr. Wallace was actually an actor working with the researcher, and every participant was always assigned to be the teacher. The real study wasn't about learning at all. It was about how far someone would go in hurting another person simply because an authority figure told them to. The teacher watched as Mr. Wallace was led to an adjacent room and strapped into a chair with electrodes attached to his wrist. Mr. Wallace mentioned that he had a heart condition, expressing mild concern about the shocks. The researcher assured him the shocks would be painful but not dangerous. The teacher was then taken to the main room, separated from the learner by a wall, and seated in front of an impressive shock generator. This shock generator was a key part of the experiment's psychology. It was a large, professional-looking device with 30 switches arranged in a horizontal line. Each switch was labeled with a voltage, starting at 15 volts and increasing by 15-volt increments up to 450 volts. The switches were also labeled with descriptions: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, and finally, ominously, 2 switches simply labeled XXX. To make the scenario feel real, the researcher gave the teacher a sample shock of 45 volts. This was the only real shock in the entire experiment, but it was unpleasant enough to convince the teacher that the machine was genuine and powerful. The teacher now believed he would be administering increasingly painful shocks to Mr. Wallace, the learner, who was strapped in a chair in the next room. The experiment began. The teacher read word pairs to the learner through a microphone: blue box, nice day, wild duck. Then the teacher would test the learner, providing a word and 4 possible matches, and the learner would indicate his answer by pressing one of 4 buttons. For each correct answer, the teacher moved to the next word pair. For each wrong answer, the teacher was instructed to administer a shock and announce the voltage before pressing the switch. At first, things proceeded smoothly. The learner got some answers right, some wrong, and the shocks remained low. But as the test continued and the learner made more mistakes, the voltage increased. At 75 volts, the teacher heard the learner grunt through the wall. At 120 volts, the learner shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, the learner demanded to be released from the experiment, saying his heart was bothering him. This is where the psychological pressure on the teacher intensified. The researcher, standing nearby with a clipboard, calmly instructed the teacher to continue. When the teacher hesitated or objected, the researcher had a series of standardized responses, delivered in a firm but not hostile tone. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on. As the voltage increased, the learner's protests became more desperate. At 180 volts, he cried out that he couldn't stand the pain. At 300 volts, he pounded on the wall, screaming. At 315 volts, he pounded again and then fell silent. No more responses, no more screams, just silence. The researcher instructed the teacher to treat this silence as a wrong answer and to continue administering shocks, even though the learner was no longer responding at all. Before conducting his experiment, Milgram had surveyed psychiatrists, asking them what percentage of participants they thought would continue to the maximum voltage. The psychiatrists predicted that only a pathological few, perhaps 1 or 2%, would go all the way. They believed that most people would refuse to continue once the learner showed obvious distress, and that virtually everyone would stop well before reaching the highest shocks. These predictions reflected what most people want to believe about human nature. That we're fundamentally decent, that we won't seriously harm another person without strong justification, that our conscience would prevent such actions. The psychiatrists were wrong. In Milgram's initial experiment, 65% of participants, almost 2 out of 3, continued to the maximum voltage of 450 volts, administering what they believed were potentially lethal shocks to an innocent person who had not only stopped responding, but whose heart condition they'd been told about. They did this not under threat of punishment to themselves, not for money or reward, but simply because a researcher in a lab coat told them to continue. The participants weren't psychopaths or sadists. They were ordinary people, postal workers, high school teachers, salesmen, engineers. During the experiment, they showed clear signs of stress and moral conflict. They sweated, they trembled, they argued with the researcher, they laughed nervously, they groaned. Some bit their lips until they bled. Many said they wanted to stop, that this was wrong, that they couldn't continue. But when the researcher calmly insisted that the experiment required them to go on, most did. After each session, Milgram carefully debriefed the participants, revealing that Mr. Wallace had never actually been shocked, that he was an actor, and that the entire scenario had been staged. Many participants expressed intense relief. Some broke down crying, others became angry at having been deceived. Milgram provided counseling to help participants process what they'd learned about themselves and to minimize psychological harm from the experience. Milgram conducted multiple variations of his basic experiment to understand what factors influenced obedience. He found that physical proximity mattered enormously. When the teacher could see the learner in the same room, obedience dropped to 40%. When the teacher had to physically hold the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%. The more direct and personal the harm, the harder it was to obey. The authority figure's proximity also mattered. When the researcher gave instructions by telephone rather than being present in the room, obedience dropped dramatically. Some participants pretended to continue, but actually administered lower shocks than instructed once the researcher couldn't directly observe them. The physical presence of authority increased compliance. The setting's prestige influenced obedience as well. Milgram conducted a variation of his experiment in a rundown office building rather than at Yale, removing the prestigious university affiliation. Obedience rates dropped, but not as much as you might expect. 48% still went to maximum voltage. Authority and scientific trappings were powerful even without an elite institution's backing. When participants saw other teachers refuse to continue, their own disobedience increased dramatically. Having models of dissent, seeing that refusal was possible, made it easier for participants to follow their conscience. This finding suggests that one of authority's powers is making disobedience seem impossible, making compliance feel like the only option. The implications of Milgram's findings were profound and deeply unsettling. The experiment was conducted less than 20 years after the Holocaust, and Milgram explicitly connected his work to trying to understand how ordinary Germans had participated in genocide. The common explanation had been that Germans were somehow different, that there was something about German culture or the German people that made them uniquely susceptible to following orders to commit atrocities. Milgram's results suggested something more disturbing, that the capacity for this kind of obedience was universal, that ordinary people in any culture could be led to harm others through a combination of legitimate authority, gradual escalation, and situational pressures that made refusal difficult. The banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt had called it, wasn't specifically German. It was human. Critics of Milgram's work have raised numerous concerns. The experiment involved deception and caused genuine psychological distress to participants who believed they were seriously harming another person. Many participants left the study having learned something troubling about themselves, that they were capable of cruelty when ordered by authority. This knowledge could be traumatic, potentially damaging participants' self-concept and mental health. Recent reanalysis of Milgram's data and methodology has revealed that the experiment was more complex than his published papers suggested. Audio recordings show that the researcher sometimes pushed back against participants' objections more aggressively than the standardized prods indicated. Some participants reported disbelieving the experimental setup, suspecting that the shocks weren't real. The level of obedience may have been influenced by factors Milgram didn't fully report. Despite these criticisms, Milgram's obedience experiments remain among psychology's most cited studies. They've fundamentally shaped how we think about authority, moral responsibility, and the psychological factors that can lead ordinary people to participate in harmful actions. The experiments demonstrated that situational factors can be extraordinarily powerful in determining behavior, sometimes overriding deeply held values and basic moral intuitions. The Milgram experiments couldn't be conducted today in their original form. Modern ethical standards require that research not cause significant psychological distress, that deception be minimal and justified, and that participants be free to withdraw at any time without pressure. The experiments are taught in ethics courses as examples of research that, despite producing valuable knowledge, violated participants' rights and dignity in ways we now recognize as unacceptable. In 1953, in the classified offices of the Central Intelligence Agency, a program was born that would become one of the most notorious examples of unethical human experimentation in American history. Project MKUltra, officially sanctioned by CIA Director Allen Dulles, had an ambitious and disturbing goal: to develop techniques for mind control and interrogation that could be used against enemy agents, to create drugs and procedures that could extract information from unwilling subjects, and to explore whether human consciousness itself could be manipulated and controlled. The context for MKUltra's creation was the Cold War, a period of intense paranoia and competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. American intelligence agencies were convinced that communist countries were developing sophisticated brainwashing techniques. Reports of American prisoners of war in Korea, apparently confessing to war crimes and denouncing capitalism, fueled fears that the Soviets and Chinese had discovered methods for controlling human minds. The CIA believed that America needed similar capabilities, both to understand enemy techniques and to develop countermeasures. MKUltra was headed by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who directed the CIA's technical services staff. Gottlieb was given broad authority and substantial funding to explore any method that might contribute to mind control research. The program would eventually encompass 149 separate subprojects, involving universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies across the United States and Canada. Most of the institutions and researchers participating had no idea they were working for the CIA. Funding was funneled through front organizations with innocuous-sounding names. The cornerstone of MKUltra research was lysergic acid diethylamide, better known as LSD. This powerful hallucinogenic drug had been discovered by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1938, but its mind-altering properties weren't fully recognized until 1943. By the early 1950s, the CIA had become intensely interested in LSD's potential applications. If a drug could so profoundly alter consciousness and perception, perhaps it could be used to disorient enemy agents during interrogation, to implant suggestions that subjects would follow unknowingly, or to erase memories and reprogram human minds. What made MKUltra particularly unethical was that much of the research involved dosing subjects with LSD without their knowledge or consent. CIA operatives would slip the drug into the drinks of colleagues, observing the effects from behind two-way mirrors. One of the most tragic cases involved Dr. Frank Olson, a biological warfare researcher who worked with the CIA. In 1953, Olson was secretly given LSD during a retreat with CIA colleagues. He had a severe psychotic reaction to the drug, becoming paranoid and deeply distressed. 9 days after being dosed with LSD, Frank Olson fell to his death from a 13th-floor hotel window in New York City. The CIA initially told his family that Olson had jumped, implying suicide due to work-related stress. They didn't mention the LSD. The truth about what happened to Olson wouldn't emerge until 1975, more than 2 decades later. His family has long questioned whether his death was actually suicide or whether he was pushed, possibly because he knew too much about biological warfare programs or because his reaction to LSD made him a security risk. But CIA employees weren't the only subjects of MKUltra experiments. The program sought out vulnerable populations who could be experimented on without creating complications. Mental patients in hospitals were given massive doses of LSD, sometimes for days or weeks at a time, with no knowledge of what was being done to them or why. Prisoners in federal penitentiaries were offered sentence reductions in exchange for participating in drug experiments, but they often weren't told what drugs they'd receive or what the potential effects might be. Perhaps most disturbingly, the CIA funded experiments at brothels in San Francisco and New York that came to be known as Operation Midnight Climax. CIA agents would lure unsuspecting men to these locations, where prostitutes working for the agency would give the men drinks laced with LSD. The agents would then observe the men's behavior through two-way mirrors, recording their responses to the drug and their activities. These men had no idea they were being drugged and observed, no idea they were part of a government experiment, and no opportunity to consent or refuse. One of MKUltra's most extensive subprograms was conducted at McGill University in Montreal by Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist who believed he could cure mental illness by erasing existing memories and reprogramming patients with healthy patterns. Cameron's approach, which he called psychic driving, involved putting patients into drug-induced comas for weeks or months, subjecting them to massive electroshock treatments far beyond standard therapeutic levels, and playing repeated tape-recorded messages to their unconscious minds. Cameron's patients, who had typically sought treatment for relatively minor conditions like anxiety or postpartum depression, were subjected to his extreme procedures without informed consent. Many lost significant memories of their lives. They couldn't remember their children, their marriages, or major life events. Some lost the ability to feed themselves or use the bathroom. The therapy essentially destroyed their existing personalities without successfully creating the healthy reprogramming Cameron promised. These patients' lives were devastated by treatments funded by MKUltra, though they had no idea the CIA was involved. The CIA's interest in mind control extended beyond drugs. MKUltra funded research into hypnosis, exploring whether hypnotized subjects could be compelled to commit acts against their will or to forget actions they'd taken. They studied sensory deprivation, building isolation tanks and examining how extended periods without sensory input affected mental functioning and suggestibility. They investigated the effects of radiation, electric shock, and various chemicals on brain function and behavior. Some MKUltra experiments ventured into territory that seems like science fiction. Researchers explored whether extrasensory perception and telepathy were real and could be weaponized. They investigated whether radio waves at specific frequencies could influence mood or behavior. They examined whether mind control could be achieved through surgical brain implants. Most of these exotic approaches produced no useful results, but the willingness to explore them demonstrates how far the CIA was willing to go in pursuit of mind control capabilities. Throughout all this experimentation, record-keeping was deliberately minimal. Sidney Gottlieb and other MKUltra administrators knew their activities were ethically questionable and legally problematic. They wanted plausible deniability and protection from future scrutiny. Most subprojects involved only brief written records, and even those were kept compartmentalized so that no single document revealed the program's full scope. Participants were identified by code names, locations were obscured, and specific procedures were often described only in vague terms. In 1973, as Watergate scandals were exposing government wrongdoing, and as CIA Director Richard Helms was preparing to retire, Gottlieb and Helms made a fateful decision. They ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. CIA personnel spent days feeding documents into shredders and incinerators, eliminating as much evidence of the program as possible. This destruction meant that victims of MKUltra experiments would have extreme difficulty proving what had been done to them, and that the full extent of the program's activities might never be known. But Gottlieb and Helms's document destruction wasn't quite complete. In 1977, through a Freedom of Information Act request, a cache of approximately 20,000 documents was discovered. These records had survived because they'd been incorrectly filed in a financial records building rather than with operational documents. These surviving papers provided the first detailed public evidence of MKUltra's existence and activities, though they represented only a fraction of the program's full scope. The public revelation of MKUltra sparked outrage and led to Senate hearings in 1977, chaired by Senator Frank Church. These hearings exposed the program's scope and the extent to which the CIA had experimented on unwitting American citizens. Witnesses testified about their experiences, families of victims came forward, and CIA officials were forced to answer uncomfortable questions about illegal domestic activities. The hearings revealed a pattern of abuse that violated not just ethical standards, but also the CIA's own charter, which prohibited domestic operations. The legal aftermath of MKUltra was complex and often unsatisfying for victims. Frank Olson's family received a settlement and a formal apology from the government, but only after decades of seeking truth. Victims of Donald Ewan Cameron's experiments in Montreal eventually won a lawsuit against the Canadian government and received settlements, though the CIA was not held directly accountable. Many other victims never received any acknowledgement or compensation, because the document destruction made it impossible to prove their involvement in the program. The scientific legacy of MKUltra is murky at best. The program generated little useful intelligence or effective mind control techniques. LSD turned out to be too unpredictable for interrogation use. It could make subjects paranoid and uncooperative as easily as it could make them suggestible. The brutal electroshock and sensory deprivation methods proved ineffective at creating lasting personality changes or reliable behavioral control. The exotic approaches like telepathy and radio wave mind control produced no actionable results. Millions of dollars and countless human subjects had been consumed in research that yielded minimal practical returns. Project MKUltra stands as a cautionary tale about what can happen when intelligence agencies operate without effective oversight, when national security is invoked to justify unethical actions, and when secrecy prevents accountability. The program's existence challenges comfortable assumptions about government agencies respecting citizens' rights and about the medical profession's commitment to first, do no harm. It demonstrates that even in a democracy, abuse can flourish when it's hidden from public view. In 1970, sociologist Laud Humphreys published a book titled Tearoom Trade, Impersonal Sex in Public Places, that would spark one of the most heated debates about research ethics in the social sciences. The book was based on Humphreys' doctoral dissertation research, which involved a covert study of men who engaged in sexual encounters with other men in public restrooms. What made the study controversial wasn't the topic, though that was certainly sensitive, but rather the methods Humphreys used to gather his data. He had observed these men without their consent, recorded their license plate numbers, tracked down their home addresses, and visited them under false pretenses to gather demographic information. The context for Humphreys' research was important to understanding both his motivations and the controversy that followed. In 1970, homosexual activity was illegal in most American states. Gay men faced arrest, loss of employment, social ostracism, and even violence if their sexuality became known. There was virtually no research on the lives of gay and bisexual men because the topic was considered too sensitive, and because such men were nearly impossible to study openly. They had every reason to hide their sexuality from researchers. Humphreys himself was a married Episcopal priest who later came out as gay. He saw his research as potentially helpful to the gay community. He believed that by documenting who these men were, their demographics, their family situations, their lives, he could challenge stereotypes and show that many were respectable citizens rather than the predatory deviants that popular culture portrayed. His intentions were arguably noble, but his methods crossed ethical boundaries that even the less stringent standards of 1970 should have prevented. The study took place in what was then called Tearooms, public restrooms known within gay communities as locations where men could find anonymous sexual encounters. Humphreys positioned himself as a lookout or watch queen in these spaces, ostensibly watching for police or unwanted intruders while men engaged in sexual activity. This role gave him access to observe without participating, allowing him to take mental notes on what happened, how encounters were initiated and conducted, and how participants behaved. Humphreys observed hundreds of encounters over his research period. He noted patterns in how men communicated their interest without speaking, how they established consent for activities, and how they quickly departed afterward, often without exchanging any words at all. This observational research, while ethically questionable given the lack of informed consent, was not the most problematic aspect of his study. That came next. Humphreys recorded the license plate numbers of 50 men he'd observed in the Tearooms, using his connections with police departments. He had previously worked as a researcher on a crime commission. He obtained names and addresses corresponding to these license plates. This was a clear violation of these men's privacy and potentially put them at risk of exposure. If this information had fallen into the wrong hands, these men could have faced arrest, blackmail, loss of employment, and destruction of their families. But Humphreys went further still. A year after his initial observations, he disguised himself and joined a team of researchers conducting a legitimate door-to-door social health survey in the areas where these men lived. He included the 50 men from his Tearoom observations in this survey, visiting their homes, meeting their families, and conducting interviews about their lives, health, and social situations. The men had no idea that the interviewer at their door was the same person who'd watched them in a public restroom a year earlier. And they certainly didn't know their addresses had been obtained by tracking their license plates. This deception allowed Humphreys to gather detailed demographic and social information about his subjects. He discovered that most were married to women and had children. Many were middle-class professionals with respectable occupations. Most didn't identify as gay or bisexual and didn't participate in gay community life. They were, in Humphreys' terminology, covert deviants, men who maintained heterosexual public identities while occasionally seeking same-sex encounters in public spaces where anonymity was assured. When Humphreys completed his dissertation and prepared it for publication, he believed he had produced valuable sociological research that challenged stereotypes about gay men. His data showed that most men engaging in Tearoom encounters weren't predatory strangers, but rather married men with families, that these encounters followed specific social rules and patterns, and that most participants took precautions to protect their identities and families. He argued that this research humanized a stigmatized population and demonstrated that these men weren't a threat to public safety despite laws criminalizing their behavior. The sociology department at Washington University in St. Louis, where Humphreys was a graduate student, was deeply divided about his research. Some faculty members praised it as innovative and important, arguing that it revealed a hidden aspect of social life that couldn't be studied any other way. Others were appalled by the ethical violations involved, particularly the tracking of license plates, the deception in home visits, and the potential risks to subjects if their identities were exposed. The controversy intensified after the dissertation was published as a book. Sociologists and ethicists debated whether the knowledge gained justified the privacy violations. Some argued that studying stigmatized and illegal behavior sometimes required covert methods because overt research would be impossible. Others countered that no research topic justified such invasive methods, that respect for human dignity and privacy should take precedence over scientific curiosity, and that Humphreys had put his subjects at genuine risk. One of the most vocal critics was sociologist Nicholas von Hoffman, who wrote in the Washington Post that Humphreys' research represented a clear violation of privacy, and that no information is valuable enough to obtain by nipping away at personal liberty. Von Hoffman argued that sociology shouldn't become an espionage enterprise, and that researchers needed clear ethical boundaries to prevent abuse. Other critics noted that if Humphreys' records had been subpoenaed by police or obtained by criminals. The men he studied could have faced devastating consequences. Defenders of the research pointed out that Humphreys had taken precautions to protect his subjects' identities. He kept identifying information separate from other data, stored it in a locked safe deposit box, and eventually destroyed all records linking names to observations. He used pseudonyms in his writing and altered identifying details to prevent recognition. No subject was ever exposed or harmed as a direct result of the research, they argued, and the knowledge gained about this hidden population was valuable. But critics responded that taking precautions after violating privacy didn't justify the initial violation. The fact that no subject happened to be harmed didn't mean Humphreys hadn't exposed them to risk. What if he'd been forced to turn over his records to authorities? What if his safe deposit box had been burglarized? What if he died unexpectedly and his records had been discovered by someone less scrupulous? The potential for harm was real, even if that harm never materialized. The debate about Humphreys' research contributed to the development of stronger ethical guidelines for social science research. Before the Tearoom trade study, social scientists operated with relatively few ethical constraints compared to medical researchers. Deception in research was common, consent was often considered optional, and researchers had broad discretion in how they conducted their studies. The controversy around Humphreys' work helped establish that social science research also required informed consent, that deception needed strong justification, and that protecting subjects' privacy was paramount. Federal regulations governing human subjects research, codified in what became known as the Common Rule, were strengthened partly in response to cases like Humphreys' study. Institutional review boards, IRBs, at universities and research institutions were required to evaluate proposed research for ethical problems before studies could proceed. These boards specifically looked at issues of consent, privacy protection, potential risks to subjects, and whether the knowledge to be gained justified any risks involved. Under modern IRB standards, Humphreys' study would almost certainly not be approved. The covert observation might potentially be allowed with strong justification, since it occurred in public spaces where privacy expectations were limited. But tracking license plates, obtaining addresses without consent, and visiting homes under false pretenses would be considered clear violations of research ethics. The potential risks to subjects, particularly in 1970 when homosexual activity was illegal, would be judged as too high to justify the research. Some modern sociologists have argued that the ethical restrictions that followed cases like Humphreys' study have made it harder to research marginalized and stigmatized populations. They point out that requiring informed consent makes it nearly impossible to study illegal activities or behaviors people want to keep hidden. They argue that sometimes the only way to understand certain aspects of social life is through covert observation, and that overly strict ethical guidelines can prevent important research. Others counter that these restrictions exist precisely to prevent abuse, and that researchers need to be creative in finding ethical ways to study difficult topics. Perhaps Humphreys could have studied Tearoom encounters by approaching men afterward, explaining his research, and asking if they'd be willing to participate in interviews. Yes, many would have refused, but those who agreed could have provided valuable data without the privacy violations. The research might have been harder and taken longer, but it would have respected subjects' autonomy and dignity. Laud Humphreys himself defended his research throughout his life, arguing that it had advanced sociological understanding and helped humanize a stigmatized population. He maintained that the precautions he took protected his subjects and that no one was harmed. In later years, after coming out as gay himself, he became an advocate for LGBTQ rights, and some have argued that his activism was partly motivated by what he'd learned through his Tearoom research. The Tearoom trade study remains a standard case study in research ethics courses. taught as an example of how good intentions and valuable research questions don't justify unethical methods. It illustrates the tension between scientific curiosity and respect for human dignity, between the desire to understand hidden aspects of social life and the responsibility to protect research subjects from harm. It demonstrates that in social science research, just as in medical research, the means matter as much as the ends. In December 1963, a 17-year-old high school student named Randy Gardner decided to conduct a science fair project that would break a world record and contribute to scientific understanding of sleep. His goal was simple and extreme: to stay awake for as long as humanly possible. With the help of two friends who would monitor him continuously to ensure he didn't accidentally doze off, and with the eventual involvement of sleep researcher William Dement from Stanford University, Gardner would remain awake for 11 days and 24 minutes, 264 hours without sleep. The idea of deliberately depriving humans of sleep might seem less immediately harmful than injecting them with plutonium or giving them LSD without consent. After all, everyone has stayed up late occasionally, pulled an all-nighter studying for exams, or coped with jet lag. How bad could a few days without sleep really be? As Gardner's experiment would demonstrate, and as military and scientific research into sleep deprivation has repeatedly shown, the effects of extended wakefulness are profound, disturbing, and potentially dangerous. Randy Gardner's attempt began early on December 28, 1963. He was a bright, healthy teenager from San Diego with no history of sleep problems. His motivation was partly the challenge of breaking a record. A previous record holder had stayed awake for 260 hours, and partly genuine curiosity about what would happen to his body and mind. The plan was that his friends Bruce McAllister and Joe Marciano would take shifts watching him, preventing him from falling asleep while documenting his physical and mental state. The first day passed relatively normally. Gardner experienced tiredness and had to work to stay alert, but nothing seemed particularly dramatic. By the second day, problems began emerging. His eyes refused to focus properly, making it difficult to read. He had trouble remembering things. His mood deteriorated, becoming irritable and short-tempered. These early symptoms were similar to what anyone might experience after a bad night's sleep, just more pronounced. When William Dement, a pioneering sleep researcher, learned about Gardner's attempt, he traveled to San Diego to observe and document what was essentially a unique research opportunity. Dement brought scientific instruments to monitor Gardner's brain activity, eye movements, and other physiological markers. He also administered regular cognitive tests to track how Gardner's mental functioning changed as sleep deprivation continued. This transformed what had begun as a teenager science project into a scientifically documented case study. By the third day, Gardner was experiencing serious cognitive problems. He had difficulty with simple mental arithmetic. He couldn't remember why he'd walked into a room. His coordination was impaired, making it hard to perform tasks that required fine motor control. He began experiencing mood swings, alternating between periods of relative alertness and episodes of profound confusion and disorientation. The fourth and fifth days brought more disturbing symptoms. Gardner began experiencing what researchers call microsleeps, brief episodes lasting a few seconds where the brain essentially falls asleep while the person remains standing or even walking. During these microsleeps, Gardner would stare blankly, unresponsive to questions or stimuli. His friends would have to shake him to bring him back to full wakefulness. These microsleeps demonstrated that the brain's need for sleep is so powerful that it will seize moments of rest, even when the person is actively trying to stay awake. By day 6, Gardner's perception of reality began deteriorating. He reported seeing things that weren't there, road signs that didn't exist, people who weren't present. He became paranoid, believing that people were conspiring against him. His speech became slurred and disorganized. Simple questions might receive rambling, incoherent answers that wandered off topic. He was experiencing symptoms similar to psychosis, a complete break from normal mental functioning caused solely by lack of sleep. Days 7 through 9 brought increasingly severe impairment. Gardner had trouble maintaining focus on any task for more than a few seconds. His memory was profoundly compromised. He couldn't remember events from just minutes earlier. His emotional regulation collapsed, leading to inappropriate laughter, sudden anger, or episodes of depression. Physical coordination continued deteriorating, making even simple movements clumsy and effortful. His friends and the researchers monitoring him had to provide constant supervision to ensure he didn't hurt himself. What made Gardner's experience particularly interesting from a research perspective was that his symptoms weren't constant or uniform. He would have periods of relative lucidity where he could carry on reasonable conversations and perform simple tasks competently, followed by episodes of profound confusion and disorientation. This pattern suggested that different parts of the brain were being affected at different times, or that the brain was finding ways to allow some regions to rest while others remained active. The final days of Gardner's record attempt were marked by severe cognitive and perceptual disturbances. He experienced vivid hallucinations, seeing fantastical scenes, hearing voices, feeling sensations that had no external source. His sense of time became completely distorted. Minutes could feel like hours, or hours could pass in what seemed like moments. His identity itself seemed fragile, with moments where he wasn't sure who or where he was. The normal integration of consciousness that we take for granted had begun to fracture. On January 8, 1964, after staying awake for 11 days and 24 minutes, Randy Gardner was finally allowed to sleep. He slept for 14 hours and 40 minutes, woke briefly, and then slept for another 8 hours. Remarkably, after recovering his sleep debt over several days, he appeared to suffer no permanent damage from the experience. His cognitive function returned to normal, the hallucinations and paranoia disappeared, and he went on to live a normal life. This recovery suggested that the brain has remarkable resilience, and that even severe sleep deprivation, if temporary, might not cause lasting harm. However, Gardner's relatively benign outcome shouldn't minimize the severity of what he experienced or the risks he took. Not everyone responds to sleep deprivation the same way, and there are documented cases of sleep deprivation causing more lasting problems. Gardner was also a healthy teenager being carefully monitored by researchers who could intervene if problems became too severe. The controlled conditions of his attempt were quite different from other sleep deprivation scenarios. Military research into sleep deprivation has produced some of the most extensive and disturbing data on what happens when people are kept awake. During World War II and the Cold War, both Allied and Soviet militaries conducted experiments on soldiers to understand how sleep deprivation affected combat readiness and to develop techniques for maintaining alertness during extended operations. Some of these studies involved keeping soldiers awake for days, while subjecting them to stress, physical demands, and cognitive challenges. The results consistently showed that sleep deprivation dramatically impairs judgment, decision-making, and reaction time, all crucial abilities in combat situations. Sleep-deprived soldiers made mistakes that well-rested soldiers wouldn't make. They had difficulty assessing risks, processing information, and maintaining situational awareness. In some cases, sleep-deprived soldiers experienced hallucinations during military operations, seeing enemy combatants who weren't there or failing to see real threats right in front of them. Soviet sleep deprivation research was reportedly even more extreme, though much of it remains classified or poorly documented. According to some accounts, Soviet researchers kept subjects awake for weeks using various stimulant drugs, attempting to understand the absolute limits of human wakefulness. The consequences were severe. Psychotic breaks, violent behavior, permanent psychological damage, and in some cases, death. These experiments, if the accounts are accurate, crossed every ethical boundary and treated human subjects as expendable resources in the pursuit of military advantage. Modern sleep research has revealed why sleep deprivation has such profound effects. Sleep isn't simply a passive state where the brain and body rest. It's an active process crucial for memory consolidation, emotional regulation, immune function, and cellular repair. During sleep, the brain processes the day's experiences, moving important information from short-term to long-term memory. It clears metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. It maintains the proper balance of neurotransmitters essential for normal mood and cognition. When sleep is prevented, all these crucial processes are disrupted. The brain can't consolidate new memories, leading to the severe memory problems that Gardner and other sleep-deprived subjects experience. Metabolic wastes accumulate, potentially contributing to the confusion and cognitive impairment. Neurotransmitter systems become dysregulated, causing mood problems, hallucinations, and psychotic symptoms. The immune system weakens, making the body more vulnerable to infection and illness. Perhaps most fascinating is what sleep research has revealed about the brain's absolute need for sleep. No matter how motivated a person is to stay awake, no matter what stimulants they use or techniques they employ, the brain will eventually force sleep. After sufficient deprivation, microsleeps become more frequent and longer until they merge into true sleep. In extreme cases, people can experience sleep attacks, where they fall into deep sleep suddenly and cannot be awakened easily. The brain prioritizes sleep above almost everything else, suggesting it's as crucial for survival as food or water. The ethical issues with sleep deprivation research are complex. Randy Gardner's self-experiment, while producing valuable data, put a teenager at significant risk. The military studies subjected soldiers to conditions that impaired their judgment and potentially caused psychological harm. The alleged Soviet experiments, if accurate, were clearly unethical and potentially criminal. Yet sleep deprivation research has produced knowledge that helps us understand insomnia, shift work, jet lag, and other sleep problems that affect millions of people. Modern research ethics carefully balances these considerations. Sleep deprivation studies can still be conducted, but typically involve much shorter periods of wakefulness, careful monitoring of subjects, and immediate intervention if serious problems emerge. Researchers can no longer push subjects to the extremes that Gardner reached, let alone the more severe deprivation allegedly conducted in military settings. The knowledge gained must justify the discomfort and risk involved, and subjects must be fully informed about what they're agreeing to experience. In 1969, the South African Defense Force established a secret program that would become one of the most horrifying examples of state-sanctioned torture disguised as medical treatment. The program, which came to be known as the Aversion Project, was designed with a clear purpose: to cure homosexuality among military conscripts through extreme psychological and physical interventions. Over the next 2 decades, an estimated 900 or more gay and lesbian soldiers would be subjected to treatments including electric shock therapy, chemical castration, hormone therapy, and even forced gender reassignment surgery. The context for this program was South Africa's political and social climate during the apartheid era. The country was internationally isolated due to its racist policies, facing military pressure from neighboring countries and internal resistance from Black South Africans fighting for equality. In this environment, the white minority government maintained strict social control, and homosexuality was viewed not just as immoral, but as a threat to military strength and societal order. The apartheid government saw itself as defending Western Christian civilization, and homosexuality didn't fit into that vision. Military service was compulsory for white South African men, with conscripts typically serving 2 years of active duty, followed by reserve obligations. The military became a crucial institution for instilling nationalist ideology and maintaining social control. When military authorities identified soldiers as homosexual, either through their own admission, reports from others, or surveillance, these individuals were sent to military hospitals for what was euphemistically called treatment. The primary location for this torture was one military hospital in Voortrekker-Hoogte, near Pretoria, though similar programs operated at other military medical facilities. The chief architect and implementer of the Aversion project was Dr. Aubrey Levin, a military psychiatrist who believed homosexuality was a mental illness that could be cured through behavior modification. Levin would later flee to Canada after apartheid ended, where he continued practicing psychiatry until being convicted of sexual assault against his patients in 2013. The treatment began with psychological evaluations meant to confirm the soldiers' homosexuality and assess whether they could be cured. Soldiers were interrogated about their sexual experiences, fantasies, and attractions. This interrogation was itself traumatic, forcing individuals to discuss intimate aspects of their lives with military authorities, who viewed them with disgust and contempt. The evaluation process was designed to be humiliating, breaking down the soldier's dignity before treatment even began. The core of the Aversion project was aversion therapy, a behavioral technique based on the principle of classical conditioning. The theory was that by associating homosexual attraction with negative stimuli, the brain could be trained to develop revulsion towards same-sex attraction. In practice, this meant subjecting gay soldiers to electric shocks while showing them images of men, or while having them imagine homosexual scenarios. The intensity of the shocks was severe, causing extreme pain and sometimes physical injury. During aversion therapy sessions, electrodes would be attached to the soldier's arms or legs. They would be shown photographs of attractive men or asked to fantasize about same-sex encounters. At intervals, powerful electric shocks would be administered. The sessions could last for hours, with dozens or even hundreds of shocks delivered. The goal was to create such a strong association between homosexual thoughts and pain that the soldier would develop an automatic revulsion to same-sex attraction. The psychological impact of aversion therapy was devastating. Soldiers subjected to this treatment developed severe anxiety around their own sexual thoughts. Some developed a generalized fear response that made it difficult for them to function normally. Many experienced depression, self-hatred, and suicidal ideation. The therapy didn't actually change sexual orientation. Research has consistently shown that sexual orientation is a core aspect of identity that can't be altered through punishment or conditioning, but it did cause profound psychological trauma. When aversion therapy failed, and it almost always failed because sexual orientation can't be conditioned away, the Aversion project escalated to more extreme measures. Some soldiers were given hormone treatments designed to reduce sex drive or to feminize male bodies. These hormones had serious side effects including weight gain, mood disturbances, and interference with normal sexual function. The treatments were given without proper informed consent and without concern for long-term health consequences. Chemical castration was another tool in the Aversion project's arsenal. Soldiers might be given drugs that suppressed testosterone production, essentially eliminating sex drive altogether. The logic was that if the soldier couldn't experience sexual attraction at all, they wouldn't experience homosexual attraction. This approach didn't cure homosexuality. It simply damaged the person's ability to experience sexuality of any kind. The effects could be permanent, leaving victims unable to form intimate relationships even after the drugs were discontinued. The most extreme interventions involved actual surgery. Some soldiers, particularly lesbian soldiers or effeminate gay men, were subjected to forced gender reassignment surgery. The twisted logic was that if a male soldier was attracted to men, perhaps they were really meant to be a woman, and physical transformation would resolve the problem. Or if a female soldier was attracted to women, perhaps making her male would normalize her sexuality. These surgeries were performed without genuine informed consent and caused irreversible physical changes that many victims never wanted. The surgical interventions demonstrate the profound confusion and cruelty at the heart of the Aversion project. Gender identity and sexual orientation are distinct aspects of human identity, but the program's architects conflated them, assuming that changing someone's body would change who they were attracted to. The surgeries were often botched, leaving victims with complications, chronic pain, and bodies they didn't recognize. Many victims of these forced surgeries later described feeling that their bodies had been mutilated and violated in the most fundamental way possible. Throughout the Aversion project's operation, the victims had virtually no recourse. They were conscripts in a military system that granted enormous power to superior officers and medical personnel. Refusing treatment could result in imprisonment, dishonorable discharge, or being sent to combat zones where survival was unlikely. The apartheid government's security apparatus meant that speaking out about the abuse could lead to additional persecution. Victims were isolated, ashamed, and often convinced by their torturers that they deserved the treatment they received. The psychological damage inflicted by the Aversion project extended far beyond the immediate trauma of the treatments. Victims developed post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety for years or decades after their military service ended. Many struggled with substance abuse, using drugs or alcohol to cope with their trauma. Suicide rates among victims were tragically high, with some taking their own lives years after the abuse had ended, unable to escape the psychological wounds inflicted by the program. The secrecy surrounding the Aversion project meant that most South Africans had no idea this torture was happening. The program operated in military facilities, shielded from public view and media scrutiny. Victims were intimidated into silence, told that revealing what happened to them would bring shame to themselves and their families. The apartheid government's control over information meant that even journalists who might have wanted to investigate these abuses faced significant obstacles and risks. The Aversion project continued operating even as scientific understanding evolved. By the 1970s, international medical and psychiatric organizations were removing homosexuality from lists of mental disorders, recognizing it as a normal variation of human sexuality. The American Psychiatric Association declassified homosexuality as a mental illness in 1973. But South Africa's military psychiatrists ignored these developments, continuing their torture programs under the guise of therapy into the 1980s. The program finally ended in the early 1990s as apartheid was dismantled and South Africa transitioned to democracy. The new government's Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigated human rights abuses during the apartheid era, including the military's treatment of gay and lesbian soldiers. Victims began coming forward to testify about what had been done to them. These testimonies revealed the full scope of the Aversion project's cruelty and the number of lives it had destroyed. Dr. Aubrey Levin fled South Africa before he could be held accountable for his role in the Aversion project. He moved to Canada, where he remarkably obtained a medical license and resumed practicing psychiatry. This itself represents a failure of international accountability systems. That someone with documented involvement in torture could simply relocate and continue working in medicine. Levin's later conviction for sexually assaulting patients in Canada came too late for his South African victims to see justice. In 2003, a group of survivors formed the Echo Wild organization to support victims of the Aversion project and to seek justice and recognition for what had been done to them. They lobbied the South African government for reparations, for formal apologies, and for acknowledgement of the systematic abuse. Their efforts brought renewed attention to the program and helped document the experiences of survivors who had remained silent for decades. The South African government eventually acknowledged the Aversion project's existence and the harm it caused, though actual reparations and support for survivors have been limited. Some victims have received modest financial settlements, but many others have received nothing. The psychological support services needed to help survivors heal from their trauma remain inadequate. For many victims, the acknowledgement came too late. They had already lived decades with untreated PTSD, broken relationships, and shattered lives. In the closing months of World War II and the years immediately following, a secret medical program was underway in hospitals across the United States. Patients seeking treatment for various ailments, broken bones, digestive problems, routine procedures, found themselves injected with plutonium, one of the most toxic substances known to humanity. These patients didn't know what was being injected into their bodies. They didn't consent to being part of an experiment. Many didn't even know they were receiving any injection at all. They were simply human test subjects in a government program designed to understand how the human body processes radioactive materials. The context for these experiments was the Manhattan Project and the dawn of the atomic age. The United States had just developed and used nuclear weapons, ending World War II, but creating new questions about radiation and its effects on human health. Thousands of workers were involved in producing nuclear materials and weapons, and the government needed to understand the risks these workers faced. But studying radiation in humans presented an obvious ethical problem. You couldn't expose people to dangerous substances just to see what happened. Or could you? The Atomic Energy Commission, working with the Manhattan Project's medical division, decided they could conduct such research if they did it secretly on people who were already sick or injured. Between 1945 and 1947, 18 people were injected with plutonium at hospitals in California, Chicago, Tennessee, and New York. The patients ranged in age from 4 to 69 years old. They had various medical conditions. Some were terminal cancer patients, others had less serious ailments, and at least one was a child who had been in a car accident and was expected to recover fully. The scientists conducting these experiments knew plutonium was extraordinarily dangerous. It's an alpha particle emitter, which means it's relatively safe if it remains outside the body, but devastating if inhaled or ingested because the alpha particles damage cells directly. Even tiny amounts of plutonium can cause cancer, particularly bone cancer and leukemia, because plutonium concentrates in bone tissue. The researchers wanted to understand exactly how plutonium moved through the body, how much accumulated in various organs, and how it was excreted. The only way to get this information was to inject people and study what happened. One of the first patients was a 53-year-old man at the University of California Hospital in San Francisco who had bone cancer. On May 14, 1945, doctors injected him with plutonium-238, telling him it was a new treatment that might help his condition. It wasn't treatment at all. It was purely experimental, designed to gather data about plutonium metabolism. The patient died 4 months later, and his body was extensively studied to track where the plutonium had accumulated. His skeleton and organs were removed and analyzed, providing valuable but ethically compromised data. Another case involved a house painter in his late 50s who came to a Chicago hospital with medical problems. He was injected with plutonium and then closely monitored with frequent blood samples and urine collection to track how his body processed the substance. He lived for several years after the injection, never knowing what had been done to him. Medical personnel collected his excretions, analyzed his blood, and tracked his health, all while maintaining the fiction that his treatment was routine medical care. Perhaps the most disturbing case involved a 4-year-old boy in California who had been in an automobile accident. He was expected to recover, but while he was hospitalized, doctors injected him with plutonium. The child's youth made him particularly valuable for research. Scientists wanted to know how a young, growing body handled radioactive materials compared to adults. The injection wasn't related to his injuries or his treatment. It was purely experimental. The boy survived and lived into adulthood, but he carried plutonium in his body for the rest of his life, never knowing it was there. The scientists running these experiments were meticulous in their data collection. They measured plutonium levels in blood, urine, and feces. When patients died, they conducted detailed autopsies to determine how much plutonium had accumulated in various organs. They published papers about their findings in classified reports, advancing scientific understanding of plutonium metabolism. But they never sought consent from their subjects, never explained what was being done, and never followed up with subjects who survived to monitor long-term health effects or to offer any medical support. The experiments weren't limited to plutonium. Other radioactive substances were tested on unsuspecting patients as well. At Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, pregnant women were given drinks containing radioactive iron, ostensibly to study nutrition, but actually to understand how radioactive materials crossed the placental barrier. The women thought they were receiving vitamin supplements as part of prenatal care. They weren't told about the radiation, and their babies were exposed to radioactive materials in utero. At a state institution in Massachusetts, boys with developmental disabilities were fed oatmeal containing radioactive tracers. Researchers wanted to understand how the body absorbed different nutrients, and they chose institutionalized children because they were easily controlled and monitored. The children's parents were told their sons were joining a science club and would receive special food. They weren't told about the radiation. The doses were relatively small and may not have caused direct harm, but the violation of trust and the targeting of vulnerable children for experimentation without consent represented a clear ethical breach. Throughout this period, medical ethics existed, but were poorly defined and weakly enforced. The Hippocratic principle of first, do no harm was understood, but it was left to individual doctors to interpret what that meant. The concept of informed consent was discussed in medical circles, but wasn't legally required in most situations. Patients trusted doctors implicitly, assuming that any treatment or procedure was in their best interest. This trust was systematically violated by the radiation experiments. The secrecy surrounding these experiments was extraordinary. Even within the hospitals where they occurred, only a small number of people knew what was happening. Medical records were falsified or coded to hide the true nature of the injections. Research papers were classified and restricted to people with security clearances. The Atomic Energy Commission and the military wanted the knowledge these experiments provided, but they didn't want public awareness of what was being done to obtain it. For decades, these experiments remained hidden. The patients who'd been injected either died without knowing what had been done to them or lived on unaware they were carrying radioactive materials in their bodies. The doctors and scientists who conducted the research moved on with their careers, some becoming prominent figures in their fields. The data from the experiments was used to set safety standards for nuclear workers and to understand radiation risks, benefiting from knowledge obtained through unethical means. The truth began emerging in the 1970s and 1980s as Cold War secrecy gradually lifted. Journalists investigating radiation exposure and government researchers examining old records began discovering documentation of these experiments. But the full scope didn't become public until 1993, when Eileen Wellsome, a journalist for the Albuquerque Tribune, published a series of articles revealing the plutonium injection experiments in detail. Her investigative work identified some of the victims by name and told their stories, bringing national attention to what had been done. Welsum's reporting sparked outrage and led to official investigations. President Bill Clinton appointed the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments in 1994 to investigate the full scope of government-sponsored radiation research on human subjects. The committee reviewed thousands of documents, interviewed surviving subjects and family members, and heard testimony from scientists who'd been involved in the research. Their final report, released in 1995, documented the plutonium injections and numerous other radiation experiments conducted on unsuspecting subjects. The committee found that the experiments had violated even the ethical standards of their time. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 after the trials of Nazi doctors who'd experimented on concentration camp prisoners, had clearly stated that voluntary informed consent was absolutely essential for any medical experiment. The plutonium injections that occurred after 1947 clearly violated this principle. Even experiments before 1947 violated earlier ethical guidelines about not harming patients and maintaining their trust. The committee also found that the subjects had been chosen partly because they were vulnerable or unlikely to advocate effectively for themselves. Terminal cancer patients might not live long enough to ask questions. Institutionalized children had no advocates to protect them. Poor patients at public hospitals lacked the resources to challenge their doctors. The selection of subjects revealed a pattern of exploitation, targeting those least able to resist or seek accountability. The government eventually apologized and offered compensation to victims and their families. In 1995, President Clinton formally apologized for the radiation experiments, acknowledging they were wrong and repugnant. Settlement funds were established to compensate identified victims, though many had already died, and identifying all victims proved difficult due to incomplete records and the passage of time. Some families received payments, but many felt the compensation was inadequate given the magnitude of violation and harm. The winter of 1942 was brutal on the Eastern Front of World War II. German forces, engaged in their disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union, faced temperatures that plunged far below zero. Thousands of soldiers suffered from hypothermia and frostbite, and many died from exposure. The German military wanted to understand how to treat severe hypothermia and how long people could survive in extreme cold. To obtain this knowledge, Nazi doctors at the Dachau concentration camp conducted experiments that involved immersing prisoners in ice water for hours, watching them suffer and die, and timing how long it took. These experiments, conducted primarily by Dr. Sigmund Rascher under the supervision of Heinrich Himmler, represented some of the most brutal medical research in human history. Prisoners at Dachau, primarily political prisoners, Roma, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime, were selected as experimental subjects. They had no choice, no consent was sought, and their lives were considered expendable in service of military medical knowledge. The typical experiment involved stripping a prisoner naked and immersing them in a tank of ice water, sometimes for 3 hours or more. The water temperature was maintained near freezing, around 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. Researchers would monitor the prisoner's body temperature with thermometers, recording exactly how quickly core temperature dropped and at what point various physiological changes occurred. They noted when consciousness was lost, when heart rate became irregular, when breathing stopped, and when death occurred. The suffering experienced by these prisoners is difficult to comprehend. Extreme cold causes excruciating pain as nerve endings are damaged. As body temperature drops, victims experience violent shivering, confusion, loss of coordination, and eventually loss of consciousness. The cardiovascular system fails as the cold affects heart function. Many prisoners died during these experiments, essentially frozen to death while doctors took notes. Those who survived one experiment might be subjected to additional trials, tested repeatedly until they died or became too damaged to provide useful data. Rasher's experiments also investigated methods for rewarming hypothermia victims. Some prisoners were placed in hot baths after being frozen, with researchers monitoring how quickly they could be warmed and whether they survived. Other prisoners were placed between naked women, based on a theory that body-to-body contact might be an effective rewarming method. This particular approach added sexual humiliation to the existing torture, forcing female prisoners to participate in the experiments under threat of death. The data from these experiments was meticulously recorded. Rasher and his colleagues produced detailed reports documenting the relationship between water temperature, exposure time, and survival rates. They recorded core body temperatures at various stages of hypothermia. They noted which rewarming methods seemed most effective. From a purely scientific perspective, ignoring the horrifying methodology, the data was comprehensive and detailed. The Nazi hypothermia experiments weren't unique in subjecting prisoners to cold exposure research. Japanese Unit 731, operating in occupied Manchuria during World War II, conducted similar experiments on Chinese prisoners, Russian prisoners of war, and others. Unit 731's cold exposure research involved exposing prisoners to freezing temperatures, sometimes allowing their limbs to freeze solid, then testing different methods of treatment. In some experiments, frozen limbs were struck with sticks to assess tissue damage, or were thawed and refrozen repeatedly to study progressive cold injury. Unit 731's experiments extended beyond hypothermia to include biological warfare testing, vivisection without anesthesia, and various other forms of medical torture. Like the Nazi experiments, Unit 731's research was conducted without any consideration for the humanity of subjects, who were referred to as logs to dehumanize them, and make it easier for researchers to treat them as experimental materials rather than people. After World War II ended, the Nazi doctors who conducted these experiments faced consequences at the Nuremberg doctors' trial. This trial, conducted in 1946 to 1947, prosecuted 23 German physicians and administrators for crimes against humanity related to medical experiments in concentration camps. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of the experiments conducted at Dachau and other camps, including the hypothermia research. 16 defendants were found guilty, with 7 receiving death sentences. Dr. Rasher didn't face trial because he had been executed by the SS in 1945 for unrelated offenses. But his detailed records were used as evidence of the systematic nature of the medical experiments. The trial established that conducting medical research on prisoners without consent, especially research that caused harm or death, constituted a crime against humanity regardless of any potential scientific value. The Nuremberg doctors' trial led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code, a set of 10 principles for ethical medical research involving human subjects. The Code's first principle states unequivocally, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This principle and the others that followed became foundational documents in research ethics, establishing standards that would influence medical research worldwide for decades to come. However, the aftermath of these experiments created an ethical dilemma that persists today. What should be done with data obtained through such horrifying means? The Nazi hypothermia experiments, whatever their moral status, produced information about human responses to extreme cold that would be impossible to replicate ethically. Some of this information could potentially save lives. Understanding the progression of hypothermia might help develop better treatments for cold exposure victims. This question generated intense debate within medical and scientific communities. Some argued that using the data would honor the victims' suffering by ensuring their deaths weren't entirely meaningless, that the knowledge could prevent future deaths from hypothermia. Others countered that using data from unethical experiments legitimized the research methods, potentially encouraging future violations, and that any knowledge gained was tainted by the conditions of its acquisition. In 1984, Dr. Robert Pozos, a hypothermia researcher, published an article that cited data from the Nazi experiments. This sparked controversy and a re-examination of whether such data should ever be used. The New England Journal of Medicine published several responses debating the ethics of citing this research. Some commentators argued that acknowledging the data's source while using it was acceptable. Others maintained that the experiments were so fundamentally tainted that their results should be considered scientifically unreliable, as well as morally unusable. The debate revealed several important considerations. First, some argued that the Nazi experiments were so poorly conducted, with so many variables uncontrolled and so much emphasis on cruelty over scientific rigor, that the data wasn't actually reliable enough to be useful. The suffering inflicted wasn't in service of good science, but rather reflected sadism disguised as research. If the data is scientifically questionable, then using it can't even be justified on utilitarian grounds. Second, using data from unethical experiments creates a dangerous precedent. If the medical community accepts that valuable knowledge can justify terrible means, it potentially encourages future researchers to push ethical boundaries, believing their work will eventually be accepted if it produces useful results. The absolute prohibition against using unethically obtained data serves as a bright line that reinforces ethical standards. Third, there's a question of respect for the victims. The people subjected to these experiments didn't volunteer their suffering for scientific advancement. They were murdered while being used as experimental subjects. Using data from their torture, even if it might save lives, appropriates their suffering without consent, continuing the violation that killed them. The position that most ethicists have settled on is that data from the Nazi hypothermia experiments and similar atrocities should not be cited or used in scientific literature. When researchers need to understand hypothermia, they should rely on data from ethical studies, from animal models, from accidental hypothermia cases, where victims consented to medical treatment and data collection, or from carefully controlled studies with fully informed volunteers. The absolute prohibition against using unethically obtained data reinforces the message that some things cannot be justified by their outcomes, that the ends do not justify the means. In the 1950s, at McGill University in Montreal, psychologist Donald Hebb and his colleagues designed an experiment that seemed deceptively simple. They would pay student volunteers $20 per day, a very good wage at the time, to do essentially nothing. The students would lie on a comfortable bed in a small, quiet room for as long as they could stand it. They would be fed regularly, bathroom breaks would be provided, and they could leave whenever they wanted. All they had to do was stay in the room and experience as little sensory stimulation as possible. To accomplish this sensory deprivation, the researchers equipped volunteers with translucent goggles that allowed light through, but prevented them from seeing shapes or patterns. They wore cardboard tubes over their forearms and hands, limiting tactile sensations. The room was soundproofed, though a low hum from air conditioning provided monotonous background noise. The temperature was kept constant and comfortable. In essence, the researchers removed as much sensory input as possible, while keeping subjects safe and reasonably comfortable. The researchers expected that subjects might become bored or restless, but could probably endure several days or even weeks given the generous pay. What actually happened shocked them. Most subjects couldn't last more than 2 or 3 days. Some left after just a few hours. The experience wasn't just boring. It was profoundly disturbing, sometimes terrifying. Subjects who underwent sensory deprivation at McGill reported experiences that challenged their grip on reality and revealed how dependent the human mind is on constant sensory input. Within hours of entering the isolation room, subjects began reporting strange experiences. They couldn't think clearly or concentrate on anything for long. Their minds would wander chaotically, jumping from thought to thought without direction or purpose. Attempts to occupy themselves mentally, reciting poetry, doing math problems, planning projects, would quickly dissolve into confusion. The simple task of maintaining a coherent train of thought became surprisingly difficult without external stimuli to anchor consciousness. As deprivation continued, subjects began experiencing what researchers called blank periods. Episodes where they would lose track of time and couldn't remember what they'd been thinking about. Minutes or hours would seem to pass in an instant, or time would stretch endlessly until subjects lost all sense of duration. This temporal disorientation was deeply unsettling, undermining one of the basic frameworks humans use to organize experience. Then the hallucinations would begin. At first, subjects might see simple geometric patterns, dots, lines, simple shapes appearing in their visual field despite the goggles preventing actual vision. These progressed to more complex imagery, wallpaper patterns, rows of objects, scenes that played out like movies. The hallucinations weren't under subjects' conscious control. They would simply appear vividly real, despite subjects knowing intellectually that they couldn't be seeing anything. Some hallucinations were benign or even entertaining. Subjects reported seeing processions of marching squirrels, animated cartoon characters, or beautiful landscapes, but many were disturbing. Subjects saw distorted faces, scenes of violence, or imagery that provoked intense anxiety. What made these hallucinations particularly unsettling was their quality. They didn't feel like imagination or daydreaming, but rather like genuine perceptions, as real as normal vision despite occurring in near-total darkness. Auditory hallucinations were also common. Subjects heard music, voices, sounds that seemed to come from specific locations in the room. Some heard people talking about them, sometimes saying critical or threatening things. These hallucinations could be so convincing that subjects would respond verbally or would bang on the door to get researchers' attention, convinced that something real was happening. The psychological effects extended beyond hallucinations. Subjects became emotionally labile, shifting rapidly between different mood states. They might feel intense anxiety, then sudden euphoria, then crushing boredom, then inexplicable fear. Their sense of self became unstable, with some subjects reporting feeling that their bodies were changing shape or that they were becoming detached from their physical form. Identity itself, the basic sense of being a coherent person, began to fragment. When subjects finally emerged from sensory deprivation, the effects didn't immediately disappear. They often felt disoriented and strange for hours or even days afterward. Some reported lingering perceptual distortions, colors seeming too bright, sounds too loud, their bodies feeling unfamiliar. Cognitive performance was impaired, with subjects doing poorly on tests of reasoning and problem-solving. The experience seemed to have temporarily disrupted normal brain functioning in ways that took time to resolve. The McGill experiments inspired extensive further research into sensory deprivation. John C. Lilly, a physician and neuroscientist, became fascinated by the phenomenon and built isolation tanks where subjects floated in body-temperature salt water, eliminating even the sensation of gravity and physical contact with surfaces. Lilly's tanks created even more complete sensory isolation than the McGill rooms, and he used them to explore consciousness, conducting experiments on himself that included combining isolation with LSD and other psychedelics. Lilly's work pushed sensory deprivation research in more experimental and less controlled directions. He reported experiencing profound altered states of consciousness, communications with non-human intelligences, and insights into the nature of reality. His research blurred the line between scientific investigation and personal spiritual exploration, and much of it was too subjective and uncontrolled to meet scientific standards. However, his isolation tanks did provide a tool that other researchers used in more rigorous studies. The military and intelligence agencies became very interested in sensory deprivation research. If sensory isolation could cause confusion, hallucinations, and psychological disturbance so readily, perhaps it could be weaponized for interrogation. The CIA, through its MKUltra program, funded sensory deprivation research explicitly to understand how isolation could break down resistance and make subjects more susceptible to influence or more willing to reveal information. CIA interrogation manuals from this period included recommendations for using sensory deprivation as part of coercive interrogation. Prisoners might be kept in dark, soundproofed cells, deprived of human contact, and subjected to disorienting schedules where meals and interrogations occurred at unpredictable times. While not always involving the complete isolation of the McGill experiments, these techniques drew on the same principles: that removing sensory input and social contact could destabilize personality and break down psychological defenses. The use of sensory deprivation in interrogation raises serious ethical and legal questions. Is it torture? International law prohibits torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Sensory deprivation doesn't involve physical violence, but it can cause severe psychological suffering and potentially lasting mental harm. Many human rights organizations and legal experts consider prolonged sensory deprivation to constitute torture, while some government lawyers have argued it doesn't cross that threshold if used for limited periods. The effectiveness of sensory deprivation for interrogation is questionable. While it certainly causes psychological distress and might make subjects more compliant, it also impairs cognitive function and memory. Information obtained from people in severely disturbed psychological states may be unreliable. Subjects might confess to things they didn't do, provide false information to end their suffering, or be so confused they can't provide coherent information even if they want to. The same effects that make sensory deprivation coercive also make it counterproductive for obtaining accurate intelligence. Beyond interrogation applications, sensory deprivation research revealed important insights about how the brain works. The hallucinations and cognitive disruptions demonstrated that the brain isn't simply a passive receiver of sensory input, but rather actively generates models of reality. When deprived of external input, the brain continues generating perceptions. But without sensory data to constrain these internally generated models, they become untethered from reality, producing hallucinations. The research also showed how dependent human consciousness is on environmental stimulation. We think of our sense of self, our identity and personality, as stable internal phenomena, but the McGill experiments suggested that maintaining coherent consciousness requires constant interaction with an external world. Remove that interaction, and the self begins to dissolve or fragment. This has philosophical implications for understanding consciousness and practical implications for situations involving isolation, such as solitary confinement in prisons or long-duration space missions. Modern applications of sensory deprivation have moved in more therapeutic directions. Isolation tanks, now often called float tanks, are marketed as relaxation and meditation tools. Commercial float centers allow people to experience brief periods of sensory reduction in controlled, comfortable settings. Users report deep relaxation, pain relief, and sometimes profound meditative states. These therapeutic applications are quite different from the experimental isolation of the McGill studies. Sessions are typically much shorter, subjects can end the experience whenever they wish, and the intention is relaxation rather than studying psychological breakdown. The ethical questions raised by the original sensory deprivation experiments are complex. The McGill subjects were volunteers who could leave at any time and who were paid for their participation. They gave informed consent, at least in a basic sense. However, it's questionable whether they could truly consent to experiences they couldn't imagine beforehand. The profound psychological disturbance that sensory deprivation caused was unexpected even to the researchers. Can someone consent to an experience whose nature and effects are unknown? Tonight, we've traveled through some of the darkest corridors of scientific history, examining 10 cases where the pursuit of knowledge trampled over human dignity, where authority overrode conscience, and where vulnerable people became subjects in experiments that never should have occurred. These stories aren't just historical curiosities or cautionary tales from less enlightened times. They remind us that the capacity for abuse doesn't disappear with technological progress or scientific advancement. Each generation must actively maintain ethical standards, must question authority when it demands harmful actions, must speak up when research crosses boundaries, and must remember that some things cannot be justified by their potential benefits. The experiments we've explored tonight helped establish the ethical frameworks we now take for granted, but only because their violations were eventually exposed, challenged, and condemned. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through these 10 outrageous experiments conducted on humans. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you rest with gratitude for the ethical protections that now exist, with respect for those who suffered to teach us these lessons, and with vigilance to ensure such violations never happen again.